doing my intro for me, which is great. I'm going to talk about, so I had a couple of different presentations. There's one that's on the agenda, which is this one, luckily. But I had another one, and I was talking to a couple of attendees about what would be the most interesting for the audience. Which presentation would you recommend that I give? The other one was a more high-level overview of targeted attacks in general and trying to break down the methodology of a targeted attack into steps and how is each of those steps carried out. What I heard, and I hope the advice was correct, is that you've had quite a lot of higher-level general presentations and discussion already. So what I want to do with this presentation is to look at one kind of threat in depth, talk about the development, the capabilities, and then some concrete recommendations of the kinds of practices that you can and should be implementing to counter this kind of threat. What it's worth bearing in mind, though, that's the reason why I referenced the other presentation, what it's worth bearing in mind is that many of these successful attacks on point-of-sale systems in retailers and hotel chains and wherever else it may be rely on that same targeted attack methodology in order to be successful. But what we're focusing on here is one particular aspect, which is, for the criminal anyway, the successful outcome of a targeted attack. So what is credit card crime in general? Credit card crime goes back a long way, and the traditional methods of stealing credit card data were around skimming, maybe installing hardware on the front of an ATM to capture your card details as you put it in and out of the machine. Double swiping, so if you've got someone who's crooked working in a restaurant, they might swipe your card once in their machine and once in the restaurant machine. Also involves modifying hardware. Traditional card cloning, maybe modifying petrol pumps. So when you go to one of the self-serve credit card-driven fuel pumps, that may have been hardware modified by an attacker. Also involves modifying the point-of-sale terminal itself with hardware. I remember talking to a law enforcement official from Canada, I think he was. It was quite some time ago. And he'd actually brought with him something which had previously been evidence in a court case. And it was a point-of-sale terminal. And he could just take the lid off because it was all kind of taken apart. And inside, the attacker had added Bluetooth functionality, which was not in the original design, and some extra memory chips to store skimmed data. And what they'd done is they'd gone to a fuel station posing as employees of the company that provides the point-of-sale machines and said, we need to take this one away for service. We're going to take this away, and here's your replacement. And the person working in the garage had gone, yeah, no problem, okay. So they cabled it up, and as far as the garage was concerned, they could carry on selling fuel, no problem. But of course, all the attackers had to do was drive by at night when the garage was closed and establish a Bluetooth connection to the point of sale that was inside the garage and start downloading the data that had been stored on the modified memory of the terminal. So this was traditional credit card crime. This is how criminals got hold of card data. The big disadvantage of this for an attacker is that it requires a physical presence. It requires proximity. You've got to go somewhere and do something, and you might be caught on CCTV, or somebody might get suspicious and call the police while you're there, but your chances of being caught are much higher. So the evolution of credit card crime really was a logical one, where point-of-sale terminals started to be targeted through the use of software. I haven't chosen this picture by accident. Hopefully some of you will recognize the colors of those point-of-sale terminals. This is a Target store in the US. And that's probably one of the most famous and most successful point-of-sale attacks. But what point-of-sale malware is basically a software solution for achieving exactly the same thing that was previously achieved through hardware modification. So by installing software, I can begin to steal credit card data. The reason why this is possible and successful is because of the basic way that a point-of-sale terminal is architected. You may be PCI DSS compliant, and you may have all the best security in the world implemented in your network, but a point-of-sale terminal currently, by design, when you swipe that customer's card, or even when you put your chip and PIN card in, the card data is held in memory on the device in plain text. So as an attacker, my goal is to be able to get into that point-of-sale terminal and read the memory. And then on an automated basis, I can just pull out any of those credit card details that I want on an ongoing basis. So it industrializes and automates crime. A brief history. How long has this kind of fraud been around? Not as long as that. That was just, I just liked that because it was the oldest picture of a credit card that I could find. That's a Diners Club card from 1958. You can see the extremely complex security mechanisms in place on that card. I think it's cardboard, laminated for security, with obviously a signature that's impossible to forge. It's so how far back does the software component of credit card crime go? It dates back to probably, in terms of when it came to public consciousness, not when were criminals doing it, but when did we find out they were doing it, dates back probably to this data security alert that was issued by Visa in October 2008. And what this alert went on to say, I don't know if you can actually see it in this quick screen grab I did about an hour ago, it goes on to say that we have evidence that attackers are using debugging toolkits on point-of-sale terminals in order to be able to read memory and steal credit card data. This was October 2nd, 2008. Interestingly, just 4 days later, they issued another advisory that not only are attackers reading the memory and stealing credit card data like that, but they're also installing keyloggers on the device, on point-of-sale terminals. Now, you may think that there's an obvious use for a keylogger in terms of PIN numbers. That's true. But a point-of-sale terminal is very often much more than just where you swipe your card. It's the whole checkout mechanism. So there may be all kinds of user data and passwords and identity data which is keyed in. I don't know about for you guys, but I know in the UK, for example, if you go and buy a TV, they're going to take a lot of personal data from you as well because they want to make sure that you paid your TV license. So there's a whole lot of supplementary data over and above credit card data which can also be stolen from these kinds of terminals. Why do we care? We care because of this kind of stuff. It used to be when credit card crime required that physical proximity, it was lower volume. As soon as it becomes industrialized and automated, we start to see some of the really huge attacks. I'm sure you recognize some of the names there from huge attacks. Target and Home Depot are probably the two biggest ones that are on that screen. We care because they're stealing our credit card data. They're committing fraud. These are some of the companies who have publicly disclosed breaches. And I think whenever you see information like this, certainly within Europe, we could almost be forgiven for thinking, well, that only affects America, doesn't it? But we don't have breach disclosure legislation in Europe. So there's no obligation on a breached organization currently to come out and say, hey, we got breached and we're really sorry. You might just get an email from the bank that says, something might have happened, we're not sure, we're just going to give you a new credit card number. And that's all we ever know. So we can be forgiving for thinking this is an American problem, but I assure you it's not. And we'll go to some detail on that later on. Target, 40 million credit card. Home Depot, 56 million credit card details. This is high volume. And actually, it's such high volume that just simple economics, it's massively influenced the value of credit cards on the underground market. The price of buying stolen credit card details is steadily being driven lower and lower and lower because there's a huge oversupply of data. These are infection statistics taken from Trend Micro's own data. So what you need to remember looking at this is, and this is true whenever you see any data from any vendor, this is only representative of what we see, basically our customer base, our installed base. What do we intercept? But I think it's fairly representative in that the vast majority are in the US, and the vast majority is in retail, food, beverage, hotel, that kind of stuff. But it's worth noting that it's not all in the US. There are plenty of other colors there as well. So this is an international crime affecting everybody. I'm going to go into some details about chip and PIN a little bit later on because we seem to think that's the panacea. But certainly, yeah, it overwhelmingly affects the US. I think part of the reason for that is that I love the squeaky floor. I noticed that when I came in. Part of the reason for that is that the US is a culture which I think for decades has been a credit card culture and a very low security credit card culture. When I was a teenager, I remember I used to watch American shows on TV and I was always amazed that the kids could take their parents' credit cards and go and buy something. And I was thinking, I wish I could do that. But in a shop in Europe, if I went in with Mrs. Ferguson's credit card, they would notice, and I wouldn't be allowed to buy anything. But it seems that in the US, possession of the plastic is enough for authorization of the sale. And it's, so for decades, they've been having multiple cards, and everything is paid for on plastic, so it's a great big target. That's why it's more attractive, that's why it's more targeted. It's not really a question of card security, and we've got some data to support that. So what I wanted to go through, first of all, is what is a point-of-sale RAM scraper? What kinds of malware are we talking about here? What's the development, and how do they look? What is their functionality? So this is a chart that we put together that goes back to 2009. The red lines are lines of relationship. Either it's a direct descendant of the malware that the later one is joined to, or it shares significant functionality. So you can see that there's a couple of interesting things here. A, there are probably more variants than you would imagine. But B, and I think most significantly, I think there are 7 variants from between 2009 and 2014, but then look at 2014 in terms of rate of development and innovation in this space. Suddenly, this has gone from being something which specialized criminals are involved in to a much bigger business, much bigger focus, much greater focus from criminals on developing tools and toolkits to be able to carry out these kinds of attacks. Yeah. I should have done that before I said that, shouldn't I? There's been, as with any online crime, significant evolution over time. We've seen POS malware that is multi-component, so different bits of software, different units, different components fulfilling different functions. One might be a keylogger, one might have the network functionality, there might be another component for the encryption functionality. And increasingly, that's moving more binary approach. So we've seen a development from multi-component to single binary. We've seen network functionality being added, full botnet capability, encryption functionality, command and control, and even development kits. So I'm going to show you one of those later on, just builders. So you can just go ahead and build your own point-of-sale malware once you've got hold of the development kit. So going into detail on some of those families from the previous slide in kind of chronological order. RawPOS was the first one that we saw sometime in 2008. It was a multi-component piece of malware, but it's still in use. Believed to have targeted goodwill recently. But that was the basis really for everything. RDA was also targeting known point-of-sale software. So this is particularly targeted. It's not going after any endpoint and it'll install itself on the endpoint regardless. It will look and make sure that this is something capable of being compromised before it will install itself. And these are the earliest examples with lighter functionality. RawPOS was actually written in Perl and then compiled into an exe after that. But they were targeting specific known vendors, not every vendor, but specific ones. BlackPOS is probably the most well-known. BlackPOS is the malware family that Target fell victim to, so a very successful utility. Dates back to late 2012, but one of the things that has made BlackPOS so widespread is that, like some other well-known crimeware, the source code for BlackPOS was leaked online, and many more variants have been built based on the original source code for that. So it's become widely used. But that was what was used against Target. Before the source code leaked, it was on sale for about somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500 US. In terms of getting access to that software. Obviously now it's leaked, it's out there and free of charge. Alina was a very innovative piece of POS malware, introduced a lot of functionality which has been reused and continues to be used in some of the later families that we will look at. It was regularly updated. As it says there, the last version that we know of was 6.something. And not only that, but it was, like all good software, it was self-updating. So it would go find the latest version and make sure it was always up to date and add on functionality. And it was Alina that introduced the concept of multi-stage exfiltration. And actually, all of the mega breaches that you hear about use this multi-stage exfiltration technique, which I will talk about later on. But that was introduced by Alina. Again, a long time before 2014. Dexter was the first combined RAM scraper and keylogger. So that was the first variant that began to take other functionality which had originally been discrete and incorporate it in, and it also introduced full botnet connectivity. So everything that you would expect a remote access tool to be able to do, you could also do with this POS malware. vSkimmer is an example of the development kit that I was talking about earlier on. There's some interesting variables in there that really show the this is not multi-stage, multi-vector data dumping capabilities of vSkimmer. So some of the things that you can specify, I can't read on this tiny picture here, so I have to do it from memory. You can specify, obviously, the location of the command and control server, and also that can be used as a data dump server by HTTP. So it can just use HTTP, because that's obviously the most open protocol outbound to dump data on the server. You can specify the location of a USB. So a last resort might be that if your point of sale terminal doesn't have network connectivity, you can dump to a known USB device that has been installed by an insider, an accomplice. And the final method is that if it couldn't find a USB and if it couldn't find network connectivity, it would still collect all of that credit card data and just dump it to a plain text file on the system, which could then be recovered using that remote connectivity feature or manually at a later date. But this was WYSIWYG POS RAM scraping software. Click-through interface, builder, and off you go. So it's really beginning to become commoditized at this point. Chewbacca was called Chewbacca because the command and control server front page had a big picture of Chewbacca on it, so it was kind of obvious what we had to call it. And that actually used Tor as an exfiltration method. I know Tor has been mentioned in some of the other sessions during the event. Criminals like Tor because of the anonymity that it offers. So it's being incorporated into all kinds of malware. We know a couple of years ago when Tor functionality was incorporated into a particular botnet that it was so visible that there was a massive spike in Tor traffic from every country around the world except for one. So it was kind of obvious where that had come from. But of course, you can't guarantee that a point of sale terminal is going to have Tor capability, so a part of the installer for Chewbacca would also install the Tor proxy to make sure that it could carry out that kind of communication. Also a keylogger as well. It's becoming more consolidated. JackPOS was probably the first one that we saw where the files were pretending to be Java-related files. So if you're looking through the hard drive, nothing stands out as being overtly malicious. If you're just going by file names and what's installed on the system, it pretends to be Java. But again, they're learning from other industries, because one thing that JackPOS does is to install a watchdog process, which is the kind of thing you find with security software. To make sure that attackers are not suppressing your security, there's a watchdog process that will consistently make sure that the security is running, that it's not being suppressed by an attacker. Well, attackers do that too with their own software. So once compromised, JackPOS will consistently check for its own presence and relaunch itself as required. So even if it's killed, it'll come back. Sometimes they come back. Decibel was beginning to audit the system. So Decibel would start to make a log of what was installed on the system, and as well as the stolen personal information and credit card data, it would send all of this audit data about debugging tools, about system tools, about security tools, and send all that back to the command and control server. And again, we see other functionality borrowed from other kinds of crimeware. Zeus is well known and everywhere. It hooks the same processes that Zeus hooks in order to be successful. So it hooks APIs so it can inject itself into running processes. And it also hooks the browser function for HTTP post so that it can intercept any data submitted over a web form. So again, on a point-of-sale terminal, remember, it's not just about the thing that you put your card into, it's about the whole terminal. So if there are any sensitive network credentials being entered during a maintenance phase, for example, that stuff is also all collected and sent back to the attackers. If it's being used for any kind of browser-based posting activity, it can be intercepted by the attackers. BrutePOS is interesting. BrutePOS was designed, I think, to take advantage of PCI DSS non-compliance, because it basically reason for the name, looks for open RDP ports across the network and will try a brute force attack with known username password combinations, weak username password combinations, in order to install itself further through the organization, looking for known point of sale implementations. Backoff is a very successful variant of the original Alina that we spoke about before. And according to US Secret Service, Backoff is responsible for now multiple thousands of compromised retailers. It's a very widespread tool. And again, you can see this consistent evolution of toolkits and functionality in that not only is it scraping RAM, but it's also keylogging, and it installs the watchdog process. So it takes what Alina started, single binary approach, it takes ideas from other tools and begins to integrate them, and these become fully featured, fully functional malware. BlackPOS, these are probably the two most recent. BlackPOS version 2 and NewPOS things. BlackPOS 2 is obviously, as it says there, was the malware used against Home Depot in a very, very, probably the most successful point of sale breach that we've seen so far in terms of number of cards stolen. Was called also by some framework POS because the tactics that were used in the initial attacks with this is that it would pretend to be McAfee antivirus. And there's a certain file used by McAfee called framework, which is part of the underlying structure of the McAfee AV, and it would pretend to be a component of McAfee to try and evade detection. So that, hence the framework. This also used that multi-stage exfiltration and was encrypting the stolen data. So if you're inspecting the network traffic, looking with DLP, for example, for known credit card numbers traveling across the network in the clear, which is something you would want to know about, this would be encrypted with a simple substitution cipher. So not massively complex. But the latest variant that we found of POS malware is called NewPOS Things. And this also harvests VNC credentials. So it's looking for credentials to target attacks elsewhere within the system beyond point of sale. But this also begins to use public-private key pair encryption to encrypt the data. So it's continued innovation, continued complexity, trying to overcome security processes, security techniques designed to detect these. So looking at these different malware families, we identified a few different methods of infiltration. This was the best visual representation I could find anywhere on the whole internet for infiltration, by the way. Because I don't know about you, but every time you get a packet of cereal, there are other things in there that are not cereal. And I don't know how they do that. So the methods that we identified, inside job, it happens. So somebody working at the store is complicit in the crime. It's less often than other times, but don't forget, this particular kind of crime started out as a physical crime requiring presence. So inside job still happens. Phishing and social engineering, something which is successful for many kinds of attacks, is also used for this kind of attack. I'm sure you all know the story of Target that started with phishing email against a third-party company that had access to Target, and further credentials were stolen, and the attack went on. That's number 2. Exploitation of vulnerabilities. If there is a vulnerability present on the OS of the point of sale or in the point of sale software itself, that can be exploited and software can be installed. Non-compliance with PCI DSS or as a part of a broader targeted attack campaign against an organization. Those are the 5 main methods used in this kind of attack, and many others, to be honest. It's what I said at the beginning. Although this is a specific presentation about point-of-sale breach, there are many lessons to learn from this about network and cybersecurity in general. So what do we do once we're on the point-of-sale terminal? How do we get into the memory, and what are we looking for, and how do we find it? So it's about hooking processes. So there are 2 Windows processes that you can hook, which will help you to list running processes on the terminal, and then inject the malware into those processes and inspect the memory space that's in use. And then it's a very simple method of using just something like a regular expression to look for data in memory which corresponds to a particular format, i.e. a credit card PAN number, the main number of the credit card, and start to pull them out. The other thing that's very interesting that developers of POS malware are doing is implementing blacklists. Because if I started to enumerate running processes on a point-of-sale system and then began to inspect and search through the memory of every single one of those processes, that could end up being quite an intensive operation on that endpoint. And I'm going to get spotted. I'm going to get noticed. So developers begin to blacklist processes. So you'll find that POS malware, for example, if it detects Internet Explorer running or Firefox or whatever it might be, it simply won't inspect that memory space because it knows that that process isn't going to contain data that is useful. So they begin to blacklist things which will use up cycles and use up time. The techniques used in general by POS malware to steal data from an organization are many and varied. It could be simple FTP from the infected endpoint. It could be bot functionality with the command and control server. One of the other things that we see is that the attacker will compromise a third-party site. Has nothing to do with the attacker, has nothing to do with the victim, but they'll compromise it and use that as a drop zone. So if your point of sale is making an outbound connection, it will appear to be going to a completely innocent website that has nothing to do with crime or malware, but that website's been compromised, and the point of sale is dropping the sensitive data on this compromised website, and the criminal can simply go and collect it at a later date. They may also be sending the data to bulletproof hosted services, which are run by the criminals themselves, of course. A little more likely to be detected by standard network-based security, though, because that's the kind of stuff, hopefully, that gets blacklisted by security companies more often than the innocent sites. At least that's what we would like to achieve. We've seen Tor, as I mentioned before. We've also seen email, because, again, SMTP is one of those outbound ports which is most often open from an organization. So sometimes you'll have a piece of POS malware which is capable of simply taking the data, encrypting it, throwing it in an email, and sending it out of the organization that way to registered email addresses with providers like Yahoo or MSN or even criminal providers. Backdoors, which allow the attacker complete control over the compromised endpoint, or as a last resort, manual removal. So that could be with the USB key that I was talking about. It could be the inside person taking the USB key, or manual removal might mean that I'm going to go in and harvest those details using the network. And my ears are not big enough, I've just realized. I need bigger ears. This keeps coming off. But what I mentioned before was the multi-stage exfiltration, which is the most successful. And like I said, when we talk about something like Target, when we talk about Home Depot, any of those big, high-volume breaches, it uses this multi-stage exfiltration technique. And this is also very common to other targeted attacks that are going after intellectual property or whatever else, employee details, customer details, because what it allows you to do is go after endpoints which themselves may well, or hopefully don't, have internet connectivity, but they do have internal connectivity. So they will compromise the details from that endpoint, collect them together on an internal server, internal to the victim network, begin to take them from all of the different compromised point-of-sale terminals or other endpoints, collect them all together, and then encrypt them on that server and send them out of the organization chunked up, or go in and pull them out manually to an external server, whether it's FTP or HTTP, whatever it might be, and the criminals can then get access to that stolen data. This is absolutely far and away the most successful and most common exfiltration method, not just for point of sale, but for targeted attacks in general. So a lot of differences, a lot of different functionality, tools, techniques, methods. We wanted to identify what was common across all of this. Obviously, collecting and stealing information is number one. Using social engineering of one kind or another. And actually, I read something today. It was just a simple graphic that someone tweeted, which bears repeating, about social engineering. Social engineering always stops short of active collusion. It's worth remembering that when it goes beyond and becomes an inside job, that goes beyond the scope of social engineering. Social engineering is all about making someone accidentally do something, accidentally reveal something. If it goes into the active collusion phase, that's outside the scope of social engineering. Most of the social engineering we see around point-of-sale breaches is either in the phishing stage, clearly, or in the way that it tries to hide itself on the machine, pretending to be Java, pretending to be McAfee, pretending to be whatever it wants to be. They all, these days, have bot functionality. They all have a command and control server. And in the majority, everything has migrated towards this single binary approach rather than multiple components. They all use the same or similar APIs, those two that I mentioned before. This is the most common. Most of them will use blacklisting and regular expression matching within memory, and they will all encrypt or encode in one way or another the stolen data to overcome that host or network-based data leakage prevention type technology. And of course, the most popular method for getting it out of your organization is the most popular open port outbound, which is HTTP. So, what happens with all of that data once it's been stolen? Obviously, it goes to the carding underground. I don't know if many of you have had a chance to go and look at some of these forums. There's a lot of talk at the moment in a lot of presentations about deep web and dark web and underweb and whatever you want to call it. Yes, there are a lot of criminal marketplaces on the dark web, but equally, yes, there are still hundreds or thousands, but hundreds that are really interesting on the open internet as well. A simple Google search for carders and dumps will lead you to any number of sites where this kind of stuff is for sale. They're very welcoming of new members because it's a market for them. But they steal this stuff to make money. They steal this stuff to sell it to other people. So, of course, they're welcoming of new members. They do operate on a trust basis, very similar to, I suppose, sites, online auction sites like eBay or whatever, in that people will give each other reputation points. So you do have to earn your reputation on these forums. You have to complete transactions. You have to be seen to pay real money for the data that you're getting. Or if you're selling, you have to be seen to be delivering data which actually works. Otherwise, your reputation will go down and nobody will buy from you anymore. So they sell, the hackers steal the data. They sell the dumps of the magnetic stripe data to carders, and it's the carders who will monetize that data through various means. Forums look exactly like you would expect them to look. They're just like any other forum, very often run on the same kind of software as any other forum that you would care to mention. So it's interesting. It's worth looking at. When I said they're welcoming of new members, some of the things that you'll find on these forums, it's not just classified advertisements of things that are for sale, but you'll find detailed tutorials for new carders, for example. People who are posting, hey, I'm interested in buying some credit card data, but I don't really know what to do with it once I get it. There's whole sections and threads and big, long articles posted by successful carders talking about what's the best way to make a purchase, how do you verify a card, should you go in person, or are there other methods you can do? Obviously, there are classified advertisements not just for stolen data, but for blank cards, for machines to create clone cards. The whole ecosystem is alive and well on these forums. I mentioned that prices were dropping and being pushed down by this volume, this oversupply. These are 4 of the top sites we just went to check what the current pricing was. You'll notice that these are all US cards. US cards are by far the cheapest, but European cards, Australian cards, Asian cards, they're all for sale as well. It's not a restricted market. European cards are more expensive, and I think that's a simple supply and demand. There are less European cards in circulation, so the price is higher. There are more US cards in circulation, the price is lower. The same thing accounts for the difference, for example, between the prices of Visa and MasterCard and Amex and Discover. Amex is seen as being, well, it is less frequently out there. It's a less frequently used card in general, and obviously there are less stolen Amex details. But they're desirable, apparently, because the security is perceived to be less by the card operators themselves. Whether that's true or not, I couldn't say. But certainly that's the perception in the hacker community, and therefore those are more valuable because you're less likely to get caught if you're using those carding details. So once I've got the credit card data, how do I monetize that? Obviously, for the hacker, monetizing is easy. I break in, I steal the information, I sell the information. I'm out of the game, I've got my money. But what does a carder do? So a carder needs to do a few different things. First, they need to validate the stolen card details before they go and use it to try and buy something or do something. And one of the most common ways to validate a card is to do something, for example, like signing up for a porn website. Because a lot of porn websites will use a credit card as an age verification. So you can go sign up and put in your stolen credit card details, and if that works, you know the card hasn't been canceled by the bank. So that's a nice, simple card verification technique. And very often what buyers will do, certainly buyers that have a good reputation, they will ask for a sample up front. So they might say, look, I want to buy 20,000 card numbers from you, but I'm going to put my money in escrow because I can wander off on this topic for ages, but it's a specialized marketplace, and there's niches, and people fulfill all of those niches. One of them is that there are escrow providers. So if I want to buy 20,000 stolen cards from someone, now we're talking basically about two criminals, so they're not going to trust each other. So there's a third party who will act as an escrow, who maybe he runs the forum, or he has a great reputation, it's been used many times. So what I'll do as a buyer is I'll put my money in escrow with the third party, you'll give me a sample, I'll go and check the sample works, I'll come back to you, you get the money, I get the 20,000 card details. And there are people that make their living through cybercrime simply by providing escrow services, whether that's for buying cards or anything else that's for sale on those forums. But escrow services is a money spinner as well. Once that's done, you can make a clone card. You can get blanks and print them up and make a clone card and go and use them, buy your petrol with them, go and use them at an ATM, vending machine, stuff where there's not so much human interaction, so the risk is lower. But I think the most common is for what we call card not present fraud. So using those cards to make online purchases of real goods. Because what you want to achieve as a criminal is you want to turn a traceable transaction into an untraceable transaction. So the way that they will launder this money is by taking the stolen credit card, making an online purchase of whatever, an iPhone, an Android tablet, whatever it might be, getting that shipped to someone who is acting as a drop zone for goods, and then that will be sold on, generating cash. The drop zone gets to keep a percentage of the profits from the sale, so they get paid for being a drop zone, and I get clean money out of the end of a stolen credit card. So there's a whole ecosystem built around this. And you do see people using cloned cards for in-person and in-store purchases, but obviously the risk is much higher, and you do occasionally see posts on the forums where people are talking about how they had to run away from the shop because alarm bells went off and people with bazookas came out from somewhere, I don't know. But it happens as well. But by far the most common is the card not present stuff. So what can we do? What can we do to defend against this kind of attack? Now this is, like I said, it's a specific presentation, but there are many best practices, tools, processes that we can use for defense against targeted attacks in general. But a lot of the learning comes from point-of-sale attacks. If we look at the data from Verizon in 2014, 99% of cases, breaches, the victim was notified by a third party that the breach had occurred. Normally, that's going to be a financial institution. They're going to be saying, hold on, we seem to have a lot of compromised credit cards, a lot of fraudulent transactions, a lot of claims from our customers. We need to begin looking for the common point where all of these cards have been used. Oh, look, it was Target. And then the financial institution will go and say, hey, we think you have a big problem because look at this supporting data. In 98% of cases, the breach was detected within weeks or months, more often months, to be honest. But in almost 90% of cases, it took seconds or minutes for the breach to be successful. So the attacker has a prolonged period in between compromise and discovery where they can simply carry on harvesting these details. So how do I find out? How do I discover earlier that this kind of thing is going on? This is one of the points that I make in the targeted attack presentation, is that you must accept the reality that you will be compromised. You must design your security based on the assumption that breach will happen if it hasn't already. But that's your basic building block for security. I will be compromised. And there's not very much I can do about it. So what's my goal in that circumstance? My goal is to find out as quickly as possible that breach has happened and be able to mitigate against that, mitigate the damage that can be caused. So the kinds of things you should be looking for: system component changes, so monitoring the device itself, unusual traffic, unusual ports, unusual protocols, new shares that suddenly pop up on your network for that multi-stage exfiltration. Suddenly this server has a new share which you didn't know about. Well, why is that there? Who put that there? Monitor for that kind of activity. And obviously the logs of your security technology, whether that's anti-malware, breach detection, data leakage prevention, whatever it might be. I'm going to do some specifics. From a hardware perspective, what can you do? Segment your network. That's a big one. It's a longer-term process. If you don't have a well-segmented network already, that's a design and an implementation. It's longer term, but it's very successful. Create air gaps where possible. Segment your network. Install breach detection systems. Breach detection as a industry segment, if you like, is relatively new. There are maybe 3 or 4 good players in that space, but breach detection is designed specifically to look for activity related to targeted attacks. This is security technology with a very specific purpose. It's not a generic anti-malware solution. Intrusion prevention, intrusion detection. Actually, out of interest, because I was talking to somebody else about intrusion prevention, and I used to work directly in the intrusion prevention space. How many of you in the room use intrusion detection or prevention in your networks? Less than I would expect. Okay, keep your hands up, those people. How many of you have them in inline blocking mode? Yeah, that's what I thought. Now, I used to work for, that was not very many, by the way, if people weren't looking at hands. I used to work in IPS when IPS was brand new. IDS was well established, intrusion detection, and IPS came along. And I was working on the technical side of it, but I knew that all of the customers were not putting it in line blocking mode. And this was 10 years ago, I think. And I was saying to someone the other day, I wonder, because I haven't been directly in IPS for a long time, I wonder now if that's changed, if people have enough trust in that technology to allow it to make decisions. And it looks like you don't. And I would say you should. Because otherwise you're relying on people, which is absolutely the weakest link in your security chain, to make those decisions. Look at, again, Target. That stuff was picked up twice. Picked up at their SOC in Bangalore, I think, and the information was handed off to their SOC in the US, who forgot to do anything about it. And if they'd had IPS in blocking mode doing whatever it was doing, they wouldn't have been relying on the people. Use two-factor authentication for remote access, absolutely. Extend that to third parties as well. Don't only rely on that with your own employees. And use encryption everywhere. You should be anyway if we're talking about credit cards, because that's part of your PCI DSS compliance. From a software perspective, multiple tiers of software firewalls, endpoint firewalls on each of those devices that needs to be protected against unauthorized access. Software encryption point-to-point. Anti-malware, I know it's old. I know I work for Trend Micro, but anti-malware serves a purpose. You'll hear so many people telling you anti-malware is a commodity, anti-malware is dead, who wants signatures anyway? Everybody wants signatures, and I'll tell you why. There's one very important purpose that signatures still play in the world of security, and I admit it's a very old technology. But what signatures do, what signature-based technology does, is it changes the signal-to-noise ratio in your environment. Signature-based anti-malware is only one part of anti-malware anyway, but it lets you ignore all of the known stuff. So it cuts the noise, and it gives you greater access to the signal, which is what's important to you. So it's not dead, it's still necessary, it's just its purpose has changed over time. File integrity monitoring is a really important and under-deployed toolkit. That lets you know what changes are taking place with files on your systems in real time. Vulnerability scanning and host intrusion prevention. We talk about network IPS, but a lot of systems are becoming virtualized, for example, now. What does your network IPS see inside a hypervisor? Well, not very much, because it's looking at the cable. So you need to begin talking about IPS on a host-by-host level in order to mitigate. DLP is going to be successful to a certain extent, unless it's encrypted and traveling over the wire, as we spoke about before. And of course, make sure that your operating system and any applications are patched regularly. And if you can't patch them for whatever reason, then make sure that you install some kind of host IPS which will allow you to shield those vulnerabilities if they can't be patched. Configuration. And a lot of this is PCI DSS, and if you're not doing it, you should be. Make sure all the default settings are changed. Keys, passwords, configurations, whatever it may be, locations, change everything. Any information that you're giving to the attacker free of charge is bad for you. Any unnecessary components, disable, remove, like remote access, disable or remove if you don't need it. Use whitelisting. Now again, a lot of people, especially if they come from a vendor that only sells a whitelisting product, will tell you that whitelisting is the silver bullet, and that if you have whitelisting and only allowed applications can run, then great. Well, what if there's a vulnerability in one of your allowed applications? Then I don't care, right? Your allowed application is running, I compromise it, I get root, I do whatever I want. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's great technology. You should be using it. Have not just relying on people looking at logs, have an automated mechanism that lets you know when one of these things changes. If file integrity monitoring detects a change, you want to know about it immediately, and you want it in context of all of the other events that took place. So you need SIM-type technology. You need to begin to aggregate this information. Patch, patch, patch. And policy is as important as anything else. It's more boring than anything else, without a doubt, but it's as important. So make sure you have a policy, make sure you regularly review your policy in all of these areas, and make sure that it's a policy that you can enforce. Because a policy that's just written on a piece of paper and put in a file and said, we comply with PCI DSS, is a useless policy. Same as a policy that never gets revisited. You've seen how quickly just one niche area of cybercrime and malware has developed, particularly in 2014. It develops at that speed or faster all the time. In fact, I wrote an article recently about how, I invented a great expression. I even Googled it to see if anyone else had ever invented it before, and they hadn't. It was a good one. The unavoidable acceleration of everything. Everything is always getting faster. Everything. Not just in cybercrime, not just in security, but in all of our lives, in every aspect, everywhere. But cybercrime is no exception, and neither is security, and neither should your policy be. That should be a living document which is reviewed and updated all the time, which means that you have an obligation to yourself, to your employer, to your customers, to keep yourself abreast of what's happening, to keep yourself updated on threat landscape, security landscape changes. It's not a static thing. But make sure that that policy, once created, once reviewed, can be enforced. If you can't enforce it, again, you're relying on people, and they're your weakest point. The reality is that good security, good policy, good practice will make it increasingly difficult for an attacker to breach your systems. Many attackers will give up and go elsewhere. There was that old thing about two guys running away from the one guy goes, "There's a lion coming," and starts running, and the other guy stops and starts changing his shoes, and they go, "There's a lion, you need to run." And he's putting his running shoes on. He says, "It's all right, I don't have to outrun the lion, I only have to outrun you." And it's a similar thing with security. So, if you can make your network more difficult, many attackers will go and look for the guy without the running shoes. But if someone is determined to target your organization and you are their only target, they will keep trying until they're successful, and they will be successful. And I think if anything, probably out of the whole 2 days, if there's any lesson that's more important than anything else, it's that. It's that you have to accept the reality that breach will happen and design your security with that in mind, not design it on the assumption that you're going to stop any breach from happening. Quick look into the future. Just a couple of slides about where payment technology is going. This is probably familiar to most of you in this audience. Chip and pin is old in Europe anyway. So chip and pin has been around for a long time. What chip and pin was originally designed to do was to make it so that your credit card didn't have to leave your hand. Because what used to happen is you'd go to pay for something, you'd be sitting in a restaurant, you're at the table, the bill comes, you put your card down and someone would take it away, do whatever they wanted to do with it, and bring it back and go, "There you go, thank you very much." Obviously with chip and pin, you need to be near the card because you need to put your number in. So chip and pin was mitigating the card leaving your possession, and it was also a factor of authentication that was a little bit more secure than a signature. Proximity cards, I'm still surprised how not widespread they seem to be in Europe. I live in Poland these days, and I expected, probably unfairly, expected Poland to be behind in that kind of thing. But proximity is absolutely everywhere for everything in Poland. And I go back to the UK, and I'm consistently surprised how under-deployed that kind of technology is. We kind of have this perception that those kinds of technologies are designed to mitigate against point-of-sale breaches. They're not. With chip and pin, with proximity, same problem is still there, the same basic problem that the attacker is exploiting, in that that data is in memory on the point of sale, unencrypted. So that kind of stuff is still there. So when chip and PIN was introduced, we did see a decline in credit card fraud in person. But the red line on that graph is card not present fraud, because chip and PIN does nothing about card not present fraud. We still just put in the card number, and off we go. So there was a huge increase in card not present at the same time as driving down card present fraud. So they're still very much vulnerable and exploitable, this same kind of thing. So what are we seeing in the future? The big technology of the future is tokenization. There was a lot of noise made around Apple Pay, and that's a good thing. Apple Pay is not like Google Wallet. Google Wallet is still sending the credit card details stored from the phone over to the point of sale terminal just using RFID, but it's just like Leuven Pay. It's a proximity thing. With Apple Pay, what's happening in between the communication between your iPhone and the point of sale terminal is that the card data is tokenized before it's sent across. So even if I have access to the memory on the point of sale device, the only thing I can steal is a token, and the only decryption of that token will take place at the card issuer's end, because they know what that token represents. But to an attacker, it's worthless. Visa have also introduced Visa tokenization services, taking advantage of similar technology. So we can expect to see some real innovation and change in this area, but as we know through experience, it's extremely slow. I still remember chip and PIN was introduced in France at least 10 years before the first chip and PIN card was introduced in the UK. So chip and PIN has been around in France for decades. And in the UK, it was, wow, those French are very advanced. So yeah, we don't say that very often. We love the French. But yeah, tokenization is definitely the technology of the future, but don't expect it tomorrow, I guess, is my lesson there. Look at Apple Pay as a great example. Apple Pay is rolling out across the US, snowballing vendors and so on, but it's only one handset vendor, it's only one country, it's only a selection of vendors. This stuff takes time. The ladies in front of me are drawing pictures of balls. So thank you very much. I'm on Twitter if you want to catch up. Thank you for listening. I don't know if I'm supposed to answer questions or not. Good.